Hi guys, I'm Lillian.
And I'm Felipe.
And we are the Postmodern family.
We are Americans living in the UK searching for Great Britain.
We make 5 new videos every single week, and we would love it if you subscribe to our channel.
In this episode, we're going to react to a 1979 clip of Friday Night, Saturday Night on the BBC, in which two of the creators of The Life of Brian debate the legacy and impact of The Life of Brian with two Christians, one a bishop and another, I think, just a layperson, in live TV. So we recently reacted to a live comedy troupe reenactment of Four Yorkshiremen, which apparently was happening in the United States, with John Cleese and perhaps one other of the creators of The Life of Brian, or Monty Python. And we commented, just as a by and by and offhand, that there was a TV debate aired in the 70s about The Life of Brian with John Cleese, and forgive me, I don't remember the other guy, I only just remember John Cleese, where these two guys that created The Life of Brian debate what it's about, whether it's blasphemy, whether it's derogatory to the Christian faith, with a bishop and I guess a well-known layperson in the Church of England. And it's a really, really fascinating interview and brings a lot of deep questions to the fore. And I think we should watch it, pause, comment, and react to it.
Okay. Do we need to mention that we've seen this movie or no?
Yeah, sure. We've seen The Life of Brian.
Okay.
And our guest reviewers are Malcolm Muggeridge and Mervyn Stockwood, the Bishop of Southwark. I'd like to ask you, Bishop, first, what was your review of the film?
Well, first of all, I was very glad to think that you simply can't get rid of Jesus in Europe today. Ceausescu of Romania, who I think thought like most communists that they're going to get rid of religion very quickly, find that it's, as he said, it's going to hang around with us for quite a long time. And certainly, when you think of what the greatest attractions on the stage, both films and acting, ever since Jesus Christ Superstar, that's what's drawn the crowds. I mean, Jesus is a most disturbing influence. You simply can't get away from him. You may worship him, respect him, commit your life to him, or just ridicule him and lampoon him, but you simply can't get rid of him. And this is what I think is a very, very interesting fact. Even in China, in their changeover now, they thought Chairman Mao's thoughts had replaced the thoughts of Jesus. But poor old Mao and the Gang of Four now really they're on the dog heap, and Jesus is being allowed back. So that, first of all, is something which I find extremely interesting. Now, the second thing well, here's a question I would ask. What are you really trying to say in this film? I believe you were on this a wee bit earlier, but unfortunately we only got the picture outside, not the voice, which was something that husbands might want for their wives. But so we didn't quite hear your defense of it. But what are you really trying to say? Now, I wasn't the least bit horrified. People say, oh, no, Bishop, when you go there, you'll be absolutely horrified. I wasn't at all. After all, I wasn't vicar of the university church for nothing. I'm familiar with undergraduate humour. And I was also a governor of a mentally deficient school. And once I was a prep school master, and I felt frightfully at home. I thought I was just sort of back on the old familiar ground this evening. But I really wondered, what you were trying to say. I do hope you don't think I'm being unkind, because I know some of you, and I am very fond of you and have respect for you. But I say this quite frankly, I simply don't think it was worthy of you. It was the sort of thing, as I say, that at Cambridge the footlights did on a damp Tuesday afternoon, or the lower fourth when I was a schoolmaster. But I just don't know what you were saying. Then the third thing, and this I get rather more serious, why lampoon death? I think this is the thing that really, sort of worried me. I don't think I would make a fuss about Auschwitz or of death. And I mean, whatever we think about Jesus, we may think he was the Son of God, we may think he was a mistaken fanatic, but it was a pretty shattering thing what happened, the crucifixion. And as I looked at that, and I thought of now the way people react to the cross, and after all, I'm not ashamed to wear the cross here, which is the sign of a bishop. When I look at that figure, I mean, I know you're going to say Brian isn't Jesus, but I mean, that's just rubbish. The heretic is quite clear.
Pause. He's saying, I know you're going to say that Brian is not Jesus.
Okay.
But that's just rubbish, was the statement. Okay.
Okay.
So he's anticipating the remark, look, man, the movie's not about Jesus, it's about Brian.
Right.
And he's saying that's rubbish. I know it's about Brian, but let's be honest.
No, he's saying that, okay.
He's saying, come on, I know you're going to say, look, the movie isn't lampooning Jesus, it's lampooning Brian.
Right.
And he's saying that's rubbish. That's okay.
If no Jesus had lived, that film wouldn't have been produced.
But did you feel that the film actually ridiculed Jesus?
Yes, I did.
Even though it wasn't about him and...
Well, I'm
Even though it
afraid,
wasn't
I
about him.
can't take it wasn't about him. I mean, I put that as a matter of honesty. If Jesus of Nazareth had never existed, there'd never been a Jesus, then this film of Brown would never have been produced. I'm sure that's his so.
Could I
But
bring
if I might just say, and then do come and cross-examine me then, but my mind is just sort of working on that last scene, sort of the reaction. I mean, there it seemed sort of tremendous sort of joke, and people were laughing. And then you think of the reaction of a person like Mother Teresa to that scene, what it meant for her. Now, she's saying, I'm not. But every day of the week, I either say Mass or I'm present at Mass. I was this morning in the early hours, and I broke the bread. This is my body. And I took the cup. This is my blood. And I didn't roar around with laughter at the altar in my chapel this morning. I just fell down, genuflected, and worshipped, said my Lord and my God. Mm-hmm. Now, I don't think really that you come and get at me now.
Okay, so let's pause it here real quick. So clearly, this whole debate is being put forth so that Christians and Christian leaders can have their view aired about the life of Brian. And so they bring out a bishop, presumably, so that the top level of defense and critique can be put forth on the movie.
Right.
So given that expectation, did you think that the 3 points what the bishop said and the way he said it came out as, wow, this was
The
like a
most
really
salient point.
This was a powerful critique. It really got to the heart of the matter.
No, because I'm already used to the kinds of bishops we have today.
Okay, what do you mean by that?
The kinds that we have today.
And what does that have to do with his response?
In the Church of England are woolly. So they're not strong warriors of the faith. So I already feel like just because he's a bishop doesn't mean that he's going to be the best. He's going to come out with the best defense of.
Okay, but that's more questioning my statement about we expect this to be the best defense.
Right.
Forget that. So forget whether you expect it to be the best defense.
Okay.
Let's just ask the very plain question. Was it a good critique of the life of Brian?
It was fine. Yeah, it was decent.
Okay.
It wasn't hard. It wasn't a hard critique, really. It just mainly said that this shouldn't be funny because it's about Jesus.
That's it.
And that's it.
Right.
Yeah.
So, okay. So what struck me was the bishop's inability to build a bridge and cross it towards the people who do find this funny. Mm-hmm. Okay. His critique was to the choir. Mm-hmm. The choir already knows that Jesus is sacred, is to be revered, and that to make fun of him is wrong.
Yeah.
And that's all he repeated.
Yeah.
Right? So he had the 3 points. The first was...
This was childish,
This
right?
was childish. The second was, what were you driving at? What's the real point that you're trying to raise here? And then the third one was, this is beneath you.
Yeah.
Kind of.
Yeah.
So the critique, I thought, was mainly resounding for the choir, but not for the people in the audience,
Right.
who I think would probably largely be sympathetic to the life of Brian. And so let's see where that question, what are you trying to get at? Let's see how they answer that.
Not criticising any of you personally.
Well, I hasten to say that I had absolutely nothing to do with the film whatsoever. But before I ask John and Michael to perhaps answer one or two of those points, could I bring in Malcolm and ask you what your review, if review is the right word?
Certainly, yes. Remember that I was engaged for 4 years in the appalling task of trying to make English people laugh. As editor of Punch, it's an almost impossible thing to do. I couldn't help feeling enormous envy of the ease with which this particular film aroused laughter. You simply had to use a 4-letter word or display a man's private parts in the window, and the whole place fell on the ground with laughter. So that I, professionally felt rather put out by that. Also, of course, I agree entirely with the bishop that it's quite humbug to say that this is not a ridiculing of the founder of the Christian religion and of the Incarnation in an extremely cheap and tenth-rate way. Remember that story of the Incarnation was what our whole civilization began with. Remember that it has inspired every great artist, every great writer, every great composer, every great builder, every great architect, that to celebrate that marvelous thing.
Germany,
the
Inquisition and so forth, it's sort of...
Yes, the Inquisition is there. But nothing can alter the fact that if you were to make a list of all the greatest works of art in all fields and all the greatest contributors to those works of art, you would find that this scene of the Incarnation, the story of the Incarnation, has played the largest part. Now, in our 20th century, this film produces a sort of graffiti version of it. And I don't think, in the eyes of posterity, it will have a very distinguished place. The bishop mentioned Mother Teresa, and I was thinking of her too, because to her, you see, and it's something that the makers of this program maybe didn't even think of, but the person of Jesus Christ, not as a historical figure, not as someone in the past, but someone living in the world now, has been the essence of her existence. I once asked her what was the difference between what she did and what social workers do. And she said, well, the point is that social workers are very estimable people, but they do something, they serve their fellows for an idea. I serve my fellows for a person. And if that person wasn't there, or if that person was in some way discredited, then my work is over. And there are many people in the world, despite the fact that the media would suggest the contrary, to whom still this living presence of Jesus Christ in the world is the most essential part of their existence. And you produce it in a film as a derisory and absurd figure. And of course, to someone who has that feeling, as Mother Teresa has, or someone like Catherine Bramwell Booth has, they are deeply hurt and insulted. That doesn't in itself matter. I'd like to put another point to two that occurred to me when I was watching it, which
Malcolm, I'm awfully sorry to interrupt, but is it possible for John perhaps to answer one or two of those
Certainly,
points?
certainly.
Otherwise we're
Okay,
going
so
to
let's
have 9.
pause there.
Okay.
We now have a second sort of Christian critique of the movie.
Mm-hmm.
And if I could summarize, he basically lobbed 2 critiques. Firstly, he takes for granted that it is a lambasting of Jesus, just like the bishop did. And he says how it's not intelligent to do that, because all the most famous artists, architects, composers, etc. of the last centuries composed and created on the basis of believing that this was real, that this was legitimate. So you are just low IQ, let's put it in modern terms, to be lambasting the basis for the greatest creations of art in the last hundreds of years. You just don't get it. You're too dumb, I think. And the second critique that he lobbed was basically a lack of empathy. So he says Mother Teresa, who I guess universally is thought of as a object of empathy and love and admiration, people like Mother Teresa and others still hold the person of Jesus in reverence. And for you to lambast Jesus is to lack empathy, is to be basically monstrous. Those were the two critiques that I gathered. What do you, does that make sense? Is that a correct interpretation of what we just heard? And if that is, then what did you think of those two critiques relative to the bishop's critiques?
I think those were stronger than the bishop's critiques. I thought they were more effective in making people, the average Joe in the audience, think, just pause for a moment to think, actually, Christianity has played a very important role in the building of society and civilization, and Western civilization. So to criticize or even postulate that something like that event of Christ's incarnation, of God's incarnation, is unreal or not real,
or an object of ridicule,
right? Is ridiculing your own civilization that it was built upon.
Right. Okay. So then I'll give my take on his and the bishop's, I think, as well at this point, before we let John and the others respond. I think this second guy came off as bitter. His whole persona and attitude seemed very negative. And he's appealing, the majority of his critique was appealing to the past, to previous civilization, to previous artists, to the roots of civilization, which is all well and true. But again, it doesn't build a bridge to the audience and to these people who, more likely than not, don't have that same level of appreciation and understanding.
Well, I mean, the whole topic of empathy.
I haven't gone to that. I haven't gone to that one. So I'm saying, so for the most of his critique was about that, point one. And that one falls on deaf ears. Just like the bishop's one, how could you do this? It's reverence.
Okay.
Falls on deaf ears with that audience and the people who love Life of Brian. The second point about empathy is probably a little bit more potent, but if it was delivered in an empathetic way, rather than a sort of with a touch of bitterness, then it would have been a little bit more powerful. But even then, it's not that powerful, I think, because
I think if you compare it to some events that are horrific, like the bishop said about Auschwitz, you don't laugh at that.
That's right.
That's
so
funny.
That's right. So I think this is sort of getting ahead. I was anticipating what I was going to suggest, what I think the real critique should have been. The real critique should have been, which would have built a bridge and appealed to those audience members and those who like the Life of Brian. And that critique is there anything in life that you hold sacred, that you hold in special regard?
Okay.
Anything at all? What would you say?
Most people would not.
No, I don't think so. They're children, okay? If especially if they're little children, if they're babies. If you were to ask a mom or a dad, would you appreciate a movie that ridiculed your experience of your child having cancer or leukemia or being unwell in some way? And let's say it was real, not hypothetical. Well, that's because, illness is quite common, and parents go through that real bad struggle. There's nothing worse than when your children are unwell. And so if you were to ask them, would you find a movie funny that made fun of that dreadful experience that you went through, that lambasted it, right?
Right.
I think that's a different ball game. I think that's a different kettle of fish.
But how would that relate to?
That's just an example. But I posed the question: do people still hold anything sacred? Okay. You said no, and I said they still do, and it's this as an example. Okay, I'm not saying this is the example they should have used in that conversation, but I'm saying that the line of attack is, okay, what is the role of humor in society? Mm-hmm. And should nothing be off limits for humor? Mm. And how does it reflect on a society in which nothing is off limits? And what are the implications of that? What kind of what kind of future would you have if so for example today, who do people admire in our society? The NHS, right? The NHS. Okay. So during this pandemic, we had this clapping on Thursday. They were called heroes, legitimately in many instances, because they still went in and fought the disease and everything. But what if there was a movie that sort of made fun of the reverence that people have for the NHS? Mm-hmm. We've gotten in trouble critiquing the NHS before. Mm-hmm. Any sort of approach where we criticize and question, actually, maybe the NHS isn't the best thing in the world. Mm-hmm. Maybe a private system actually is better. Mm-hmm. The immediate knee-jerk emotional reaction of many Brits is defend, right? So I think there still are things that are held in admiration and reverence in British society. Mm-hmm. So the question is, are you permitted to make fun of good things that you revere and admire?
I think so. Monty Python did a skit on doctors in England. They made fun of them.
No. Yeah, they made fun of doctors. But the question is not, do you make fun of doctors, but do you make fun of the reverence of doctors? Do you make fun of the idea that people honor them? Because what they would say about the life of Brian is that they're not making fun of Jesus. Mm-hmm. They're making fun of those stupid, confused people who are following Brian around, thinking he is a Messiah or some miracle worker. Yeah, that's what they'll say. Mm-hmm. So the whole movie is a critique of them and not of Jesus, which I believe is a legitimate response to these people's criticisms. Mm-hmm. But so imagine a movie that makes fun of the people who go about clapping on Thursdays. Okay, in the midst of the pandemic. Okay, because see what's happening is the bishop and that older guy are saying there are people still today who love and revere Jesus. Right. So the reverence is live and real now. Similarly, if there was a movie that made fun of the reverence of the NHS while at the peak of the pandemic, when people were in lockdown and worried for their lives, would that be well received? What say you?
I would think it's funny.
I would too, because I don't revere the NHS.
No, exactly.
But our whole lots of our neighborhood were out there with their pots and pans and clapping. Yeah. And people were doxxed and shamed on social media for not coming out and clapping, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah. Billboards and signs. And the absolute worship of the NHS has reached religious overtones. The public worship on Thursday gathering, that's basically an act of public worship, clapping and all that together. So I would suggest that there are still things that are revered in British society. Right. And what would be the response if those things were lampooned? What would be the response of the people who revere those things?
Offense or something?
Exactly, offense. So anyway, getting back, because we've gotten to the point where the bishops responded and the old guys responded. And their response, for me, is ineffective. It does not. If I put myself in the position of a secular-minded person that likes the life of Brian because it is making fun of stupid people, and I don't have much reverence for Jesus anyway, so it's not swaying me one way or another.
You were an atheist that laughed at Christians and ridiculed Christians.
I was, yeah. So that wouldn't move me.
No.
It's only effective for the faithful. And even then, not even that effective.
Right.
So let's see what the makers say in response to these, I would suggest, ineffective critiques.
Points unanswered.
Yes, it's building up the list a bit. But I mean, the problem that the problem that we have got is that you think that we're ridiculing Jesus, and we say, sort of sincerely and truthfully, that is certainly not what we intended to do, and I believe that we're not. And I can best answer that, I think, by answering Alvid's question, which is that what were we trying to do? And I think it comes out, spelled out perhaps rather too plainly, rather too banally at one point, when he says, make up your own mind, don't let other people tell you. And we would absolutely deny, at least I would, that there was any attempt to say you should not believe in Christ. What we're saying is take a critical view, find out about it, don't just believe because somebody tells you to. Somebody in the pulpit says something, question it, work it out yourself.
You're seriously suggesting that if someone saw that film, say a young kid who knew nothing about the Gospels or about history, that the figure of Christ that would emerge from it, this story of the Incarnation, would be a noble one, would be...
He would have to sort it out for himself. And he would have to, for example, work out, I mean, does one accept every word in the Bible? In the Sermon on the Mount, did they get it all right when Mark wrote it down 30 years later? I mean, was every word right?
But is the film likely to be seen by anybody who doesn't know an awful lot about Jesus Christ?
Most certainly it is today. If you have it for children of 14 today, you will find that the many, many children of 14 today, thanks to the secular nature of the education they're receiving, know nothing about it at all. And they would see this figure, I think, in the light in which he appears in this film, you see. It's no good you cheating yourselves. You can't have it both ways. You produce this particular... film which arouses bursts of laughter, as I said earlier, rather easily procured. But don't imagine that someone seeing that is going to go away with a concept of the founder of the Christian religion and all that that meant to mankind in any way corresponding to what history or the Gospels or anything else that's presented.
Well, it's not supposed to be about him, so people shouldn't go and see it to learn about it.
That is not about him.
I'm not being dishonest. I mean,
You're being utterly dishonest,
Can I just say, I mean, I don't know where this will get us, but I feel my approach to the film was I was confused. I feel I'm still asking questions, seeking solutions. I am very confused and perturbed by a religion, an established religion in this country, where people can go into church on a Sunday morning. The same people can sing hymns and say prayers. And at the same time, these people can stand by while their money is spent making bombs, making guns, building up appalling weapons of destruction, can sit by, sing hymns, say their prayers, and agree with a policy in which hospitals have to go without money.
First of all, I'd very much like to know, we'll get your evidence.
Let's pause there. And I don't know, I dare say that this might be sufficient here in our reaction. But, okay, so now we have two voices, the two voices of the creators in response to the two voices of the critics. And John Cleese basically admits, whilst saying this isn't a critique of Jesus, it's a critique of the mindless followers who would just dogmatically believe unquestionably. He reveals that he himself is a skeptic of the Christian faith. So, for example, no one even knows who wrote the gospel, or if they wrote the Sermon on the Mount correctly 30 years later, right? This movie is about encouraging people to question everything, to have a critical eye. So that's his response. And then the second guy has a very laughable response, which is he's not responding to their critiques at all.
No,
he's doing a
totally
character assassination hard. He's like saying, what I don't understand is how Christians can go to church and pray and sing and yet pay money to their government while their government makes bombs and guns and weapons, as though the violent defense of freedom and justice and goodness is outlawed by the Christian faith, as though that is a living contradiction in the faith.
I know. It's a very weak argument.
It's a very weak argument by that guy. But let's talk about John Cleese's critique, right? So he's basically saying, look, this is just to make sure to encourage, like there's a passage in the book of Acts about these people called the Bereans. And these people, the Bible says, they heard the sermons from Peter and Paul, and they didn't just believe. They searched the scriptures to make sure that what was said was actually true. So they weren't dogmatically believing. They were questioning. They had a questioning attitude.
Yeah.
So what did you think of that critique? Of that saying, look, the purpose of the movie is to encourage questioning. What did you think of that?
Well, I think that's false. I think the purpose of the movie was to put forward his own interpretation of what has happened.
Which is to say what? What's his interpretation?
Which is to say that Jesus was not a real person, or he wasn't really who he said he was, and it was
that
all these followers that were stupid that have created this religion that has lasted for thousands of years.
Okay. So based on what he said about the scriptures, you interpret his intention to be, look, we don't really have any right to have confidence in what the scriptures say.
Right.
And this is an example of how it could have unfolded. A guy named Brian could have been made the Messiah.
Yeah.
So
that's the purpose of the movie there, I think.
So it's really to create skepticism.
Yes. It's not a fair shake at, well, what did you really hear?
Yeah.
And in fact, what I find is so interesting for me now is that The Life of Brian is, I think it's making fun of its creators, because for someone
of their ignorance,
for them to discount like the validity of the scriptures in comparison to all the other writings of creation, of our humanity.
So basically what you're saying is, if you can't have confidence in the Gospels, then you can't have confidence in Plato's Republic, in Aristotle's Ethics, in Caesar's Gallic Wars, in Cicero's letters, in Thucydides, in all of that, right? Yeah. Because for no other text in the history of man is there such corroborating and such multiplicity of sources than what we have for the gospel. And virtually no New Testament scholar, which, by the way, if you go into the academies and the universities, the majority of New Testament scholars are non-believers. The majority consensus by about 80 to 90% of New Testament scholars is that Jesus was a real person. He was crucified. He did say those things, and believers did believe what he said. So what John Cleese, as you said very eloquently, the movie reveals the ignorance of its creators.
Yes, it does. So, and that's why when I watched it, I did think it was funny.
I thought it was funny because, it made fun of it inadvertently, quite unironically, revealed the stupidity of its creators.
Yeah. How someone could twist the finding. Basically, all the arguments that you hear from atheists have been just collected in this film and just put up. And
it's like, there it is, QED. Yeah. It's been demonstrated. The Christian faith is false.
That's right.
Yeah. So I think the last thing I wanted to do, because again, I think you're broadly right? So The Life of Brian was a creature of its time. Late 70s is well past the point where Christianity had lost its grip on Great Britain. And so it's something akin to what we're seeing today with the statues being toppled. The statues being toppled is not a manifestation of a sudden shift of things in the culture. The culture has been being poisoned with cultural Marxism and hatred of the past for many generations. And the toppling of the statues is like the final fruit of the tree of that poison. And so the life of Brian, similarly, is the toppling of Jesus in the cultural landscape of Great Britain. It is the final act, not the first act. Is he going to be all right?
He's so much noise.
He's making so much noise. He's all right. He's enjoying his feeding. So in terms of John Cleese and the creators of The Life of Brian, I think it's just a natural progression. There's nothing controversial about what they did. It's the logical conclusion of the demise of the Christian faith in the British Isles. But if I may go back to how I would have critiqued the movie if I was the one being interviewed.
Okay.
Again, I would not appeal to this is a revered figure, because it isn't to the audience.
Right. Even if it was revered to historical figures.
That's right. And I wouldn't appeal to history. I wouldn't appeal to a reverence that is not there. I would appeal to the fact of what future do we have as a society if there is no room for reverence? Or, put it another way, if this is no longer the object of reverence, then what is? And what are the implications of that? Okay? So I'm going to talk a little bit about Jordan Peterson, okay? Because he makes some really salient points on the distribution of IQ in a society and what the implications are for that distribution. So the U.S. Army, he cites research from the U.S. Army, which shows that 10% of humankind has an IQ, I think it's lower than 80.
Really?
And for IQs of lower than 80, there's basically nothing you can find that person for sustainable work, for them to be a contributing member of society. Basically, they are a black hole in society. And he says he has no solutions. No one has any solutions about what to do with them. And the reason why we know this is, as I said, the Army's done research because they don't want to give a weapon or a missile to someone who is inept. And so IQ is a critical test that every person entering the military takes. So they don't admit anyone with an IQ lower than 80, period. And that happens to be 10 to 15% of society. Okay, so if 10 to 15% of society has not the capacity to handle a weapon or turn levers consistently,
Right.
much less will they be able to handle a sophisticated argument about why the faith is true. Okay? So this utopian vision that secularists like John Cleese and them put forth, that says everyone must be critical and have their eyes wide open and question everything for themselves. Well, let's begin with saying that there's 10 to 15% of the population that simply can't do that. So for those 10 to 15%, they accept on faith. Whatever it is that they believe, they don't have the capacity to critically assess. Okay? So let's set those aside. And let's go to the broad middle, the sort of 60 to 70% of the broad middle population. And let's basically ask the question, is the Christian religion the only thing that requires faith of its adherents? And let's be very precise. How would you define faith? When I say I have faith that this thing is true, what does that mean?
It's an action that you do based on what you trust you think is going to happen.
Trust, right? So you trust that a certain thing is true even though you can't completely verify that thing, right? And let's be even more careful. It isn't necessarily a blind trust, right?
Right.
It is a calculated trust. It is, I've done an assessment. I don't know 100% if this is true, but I have some level of confidence on it. And so the rest, I'm going to take a leap on the basis of what I do know that this thing is true. That's faith, right? And so to believe that only the Christian faith is the only thing, or only religions, the classical religions, Islam, Judaism, etc., require faith, is a completely erroneous statement. For the broad middle of IQ people, they operate in their day-to-day life. Their operation in day-to-day life requires faith. Not everyone understands the full workings of the engine, the car, and car motor. But when they wake up in the morning, they trust that based on the data they've seen, based on history, that car is going to start in the morning, right? They don't verify. Another example, when we take antibiotics or we take any medicines from the pharmacist for our illnesses, we don't do the chemistry ourselves. We don't work out the interactions of viruses and confirm 100% that, yeah, if I take this, it'll heal me. We take it on the credibility of the authorities, okay? So all this hubbubaloo about, actually, I believe science and I don't believe faith, I don't believe religion, is an invalid argument, basically. All the things that we accept as scientifically demonstrated, most of them, the broad middle of IQ people cannot demonstrate them to themselves. They take it on authority, okay? And it would require decades of study for them to, as John Cleese put it, critically assess and prove for themselves that those things are true, right? So this idea of trusting in authorities is true for the broad middle, and it's no different for faith. We trust in an authority, in this instance, the scriptures. And so it's interchangeable broadly. And now for the top 1 to 5% of IQs who can quickly assess things that are true, that's a whole nother ball game. So my critique for John Cleese would have been, firstly, it's inconsistent to require complete and total skepticism of all things in life, because you can't practice that consistently. Because when you take medicine, when you go out in your car, when you live life, you must trust and you must have faith. That faith is informed, and the Christian religion is no different. It's an informed faith. It's not a blind faith. Okay? So John Cleese, let's be honest, it's an invalid critique, because you don't live your life in that sort of hyper-skepticist manner. No one could live that life. You'd have to shelter yourself in a room and never do anything. And secondly, if you've replaced the object of reverence, Christ, in society with something else, what are the implications to that society? Now, this is again Jordan Peterson. Religion for the broad middle IQ is a sort of shackle, a restraint on the inbuilt, let's call it in Christian terms, fallen nature of humanity. Okay? It places moral shackles on the behavior of individuals. And don't get me wrong, in the comments people say, well, I'm moral without religion. I can be moral without religion. This isn't saying that you cannot be moral without religion. There are many sophisticated, higher level IQ people, or people who have just learned from their parents how to be moral. But the whole point is that moral code has to have teeth. It has to have consequences. It has to have power that you really believe could happen. And God, in his wrath and hell, provides that teeth for the broad middle of society. And so if you take away the object of reverence, God, and the accompanying teeth that he has for moral constructs, what do you replace it with, if anything? And will it have that same will it serve to be that same source of fear and wrath? I'm just speaking completely pragmatically, not on truth or false, because you and I both know that there are plenty of arguments that we could talk about the validity of the scriptures, the validity of arguments for the existence of God. We can argue on rational basis for the truth of Christ as God, but I'm not arguing that. I'm arguing on a strictly pragmatic perspective. What are the practical consequences of removing God and reverence towards God from society and replacing him? Now, what have we replaced him with, in your opinion, in secular society? Who
the
or
self.
what? The self.
Mm-hmm.
So we revere the self.
Mm-hmm.
And how does that manifest itself?
You place your desires above everybody else.
And what are the particular examples of that playing itself out in society?
Well, choosing your own gender and forcing people to call you different pronouns than your born sex.
Right. Dissolving marriages because you're unhappy.
Mm-hmm.
Cheating in some way.
Mm-hmm.
So all these sort of the what previously was restrained behavior, now reverence of self is showing that behavior now is possible. Basically, other examples.
I would call it self-mutilization, but it's plastic surgery.
Let's say abortion. Is abortion a sort of a reverence of self?
Yeah, absolutely.
Because what?
Because it's placing your career or
your state of life, your conditions
above the human
life
that's growing inside.
That's
you.
right.
Yeah.
That's right. So John Cleese and company perhaps couldn't have seen at that point what they might call unexpected consequences of removing God from the picture. But anyone with a high IQ, Jordan Peterson argues, is able to see the fact that society is held together. Society is composed of basically groups of different men. High-performing IQ men, middle-performing IQ men, and lower, just can't understand IQ men. And that broad middle coexists in a civilized way only when it is restrained by some fearful force of moral imposition on a practical basis. And so I would have said, John Cleese, what you've done in this movie is basically demonstrated the obvious fact that we are now in a state where God is not revered in society. Mm-hmm. Now, the movie as such is not a negative thing. It's just a creature of that time. It's just an exhibition of what is in the heart of the people today. Mm-hmm. And that's why it's funny. That's why a 4-letter word is so easy to elicit laughter. Yeah. So I would say now John Cleese and company and those who love the life of Brian, what is the object of reverence that will now restrain society? What is going to keep society cohesive and from disintegrating? And we sit now in the most potent disintegration of society in our lifetimes. Do we not? Mm-hmm. So we have mass hysteria, rioting happening, lawlessness happening. We have lockdown sort of passively accepted without question. So we have a situation where more and more children are growing up without fathers. And so more and more children are growing up to be non-positive contributors to society. And the fruits of eliminating, just from a pragmatic perspective, of eliminating the reverence of God and the belief in God are now made manifest. I think if you could travel in time, if John Cleese and them could travel in time and see these are the consequences of this level of skepticism.
John Cleese is still alive.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. But if he could travel in that 1979 forward in time, and he could see the results today. Yes. I would ask John Cleese today, do you think it has been a positive force to create and encourage absolute skepticism of Christian faith. He'd probably say, yeah, it was. Clearly, we're now free.
Yeah.
But I think it's obvious to any rational observer of society that we are in chaos.
I don't know.
Do you not think?
They continue to blame Christianity for everything. So
Yeah.
I don't know. They wouldn't say that it was their own fault.
Yeah. So anyway, to sum up, I'm not trying to toot my own horn, but I think the two critiques of the movie fell on deaf ears to that audience, and I would have tried more on a different tact, on what happens to a society where nothing is revered. And I think I want to close with a reading from C.S. Lewis, a famous British intellectual, and he has a commentary on comedy. And this is an extract from the Screwtape Letters, in which a understudy demon is being written to by his tutor. So the tutor demon is writing to understudy demon, and the understudy is Wormwood. So it says, "My dear Wormwood, everything is clearly going very well. Am especially glad to hear that the two new friends have now made him acquainted with their whole set. All these, as I find from the record office, are thoroughly reliable people, steady, consistent scoffers and worldlings who, without any spectacular crimes, are progressing quietly and comfortably toward our Father's house," Father Satan in this instance. "You speak of their being great laughers. I trust this does not mean that you are under the impression that laughter as such is always in our favor. The point is worth some attention. I divide the causes of human laughter into joy, fun, the joke proper, and flippancy. You will see the first among friends and lovers reunited on the eve of a holiday. Among adults, some pretext in the way of jokes is usually provided, but the facility with which the smallest witticisms produce laughter at such a time shows that they are not the real cause. What that real cause is, we do not know. Something like it is expressed in much of that detestable art which the humans call music, and something like it occurs in heaven, a meaningless acceleration in the rhythm of celestial experience, quite opaque to us." So he's talking about how laughter is so easy when people are reunited after a long time of not seeing each other, and they don't understand why that happens. "Laughter of this kind does us no good and should always be discouraged. Besides, the phenomenon is of itself disgusting and a direct insult to the realism, dignity, and austerity of hell. Fun is closely related to joy, a sort of emotional froth arising from the play instinct. It is very little use to us. It can sometimes be used, of course, to divert humans from something else which the enemy would like them to be feeling or doing. But in itself, it has wholly undesirable tendencies. It promotes charity, courage, contentment, and many other evils. The joke proper, which turns on sudden perception of incongruity, is a much more promising field. I am thinking primarily of indecent or bawdy humor, which, though much relied upon by second-rate tempters, which would be like the Life of Brian creators, is often disappointing in its results. The truth is that humans are pretty clearly divided on this matter into two classes. There are some to whom no passion is as serious as lust, and for whom an indecent story ceases to produce lasciviousness precisely insofar as it becomes funny. There are others in whom laughter and lust are excited at the same moment and by the same things. The first sort joke about sex because it gives rise to many incongruities. The second cultivate incongruities because they afford a pretext for talking about sex. If your man is of the first type, bawdy humor will not help you. I shall never forget the hours which I wasted, hours to me of unbearable tedium, with one of my early patients in bars and smoking rooms before I learned this rule. Find out which group the patient belongs to, and see that he does not find out. The real use of jokes or humor is in quite a different direction, and it is especially promising among the English, who take their sense of humor so seriously that a deficiency in this sense is almost the only deficiency at which they feel shame. Humor is for them the all-consoling, and mark this, the all-excusing grace of life. Hence, it is invaluable as a means of destroying shame. If a man simply lets others pay for him, he is mean. If he boasts of it in a jocular manner and twits his fellows with having been scored off, he is no longer mean, but a comical fellow. Mere cowardice is shameful. Cowardice boasted of with humorous exaggerations and grotesque gestures can be passed off as funny. Cruelty is shameful, unless the cruel man can represent it as a practical joke. 1,000 bawdy or even blasphemous jokes do not help towards a man's damnation so much as his discovery that almost anything he wants to do can be done, not only without the disapproval, but the admiration of his fellows, if only it can get itself treated as a joke. And this temptation can be almost entirely hidden from your patient by that English seriousness about humor. Any suggestion that there might be too much of it can be represented to him as puritanical or as betraying a lack of humor. But flippancy is the best of all. In the first place, it is very economical. Only a clever human can make a real joke about virtue. That's what flippancy is. Or indeed about anything else. Any of them can be trained to talk as if virtue were funny. Among flippant people, the joke is always assumed to have been made. No one actually makes it, but every serious subject is discussed in a manner which implies that they have already found a ridiculous side to it. If prolonged, the habit of flippancy builds up around a man the finest armor plating against the enemy, this is God is the enemy, that I know, and it is quite free from the dangers inherent in the other sources of laughter. It is 1,000 miles from joy from joy it deadens, instead of sharpening the intellect, and it excites no affection between those who practice it. Your affectionate uncle, Screwtape. So, what did you? The last part, the flippancy part, is the particular part of interest, I think. What did you think of that?
You should just read that part then.
You could just edit to the flippancy part.
Yeah, I mean that is an interesting topic because I think even among Christians, we do choose
flirt with flippancy.
Yes, I mean there's that one this pastor or whatever on Facebook or who made some videos, always making fun of what Christians do and for example. Are you this kind of person where you always have a verse for everything? Okay. And so he goes through, he's like shopping and he'll like, and then rattle off a verse because of the, and so that sounds to me like flippancy.
Yeah, making fun of a virtue. Making fun
of a virtue of knowing Bible very well.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's.
So does Life of Brian qualify as flippancy?
Yes, because the followers of Christ, that's a virtue, to be a follower of Christ. And to have a film make fun of the followers of Christ as painted as idiots the whole way through, I think that would be flippancy.
Right. So I think, so the Screwtape letter is basically saying the best way of using humor to send someone to Satan is flippancy, which is the making fun of virtuous things.
Yeah.
And I think I've made this comment about the comedies we've reacted to, is that there's comedy which is lighthearted and fun, and then there's comedy that's dark and makes fun of good things. And there's just something inherent, I've always felt in my bones, in the deepest of my bones, that something that makes fun of virtue and good things as being not something good, not something worth partaking in. But I'll just close with this. I really loved your statement, which is that we laughed at the Life of Brian, not because of how it made fun of virtuous things, the believers in Christ, but because it revealed like a mirror the ignorance of its makers. And at every turn, the things coming out of the mouths reveal the assumptions of the creators.
That's right.
And how false and ridiculous those assumptions are.
Yeah.
Thanks for watching this video. We hope you enjoyed it. Leave a comment below and let us know other videos that you think we should react to.
If you enjoy this content, you can always like it, you can always share it, you can always comment, and you can always subscribe. None of these cost you a penny, and they help the channel to grow. But if you really want to go the extra mile, you can become a patron at patreon.com/thepostmodern family.
Thanks for watching. Bye.
Bye.